Okay, chapter 12, sticky notes, forest management, and protected areas. So the case study here is about saving the parts of the Amazon rainforest, which you should read. It is super important, and it is considered to be one of the greatest carbon sequestration parts of our planet. So it is a kind of a big deal. When we turn the page and get to 12.1 on forest ecosystems and forest resources, you should know the term forest, which is really an ecosystem that just has a lot of trees. You should know the different forest biomes. We talked about those in a previous unit. The tropical rainforest, the temperate deciduous forest, the boreal forest or the taiga, and so on. You should know this term forest types. That basically is how they're classified. So like a forest that's mainly made up of maple, beech, and birch would be called a maple, beech, birch forest. It's not very original, but you get the gist. Or it might be an oak forest or a pine forest or something like that. Okay, let's turn the page to 310. And it shows you how much of the world is still covered by forests. Used to be a lot more, but it's still a lot. And a lot of people are working on trying to get more forest cover than there is now. You should know the parts of a forest. So this figure and caption here, the parts that are mentioned here are defined in all the paragraphs on the next page. So this upper part is called the canopy. The top part of the trees are called the canopy. Underneath is the subcanopy, and then below that is the understory. And then you have the shrub layer, which is where shrubby bush kind of things, they only get to be that tall. And then you have the forest floor and the soil. There are also things right here like a fallen log. Sometimes a tree falls over, or something where the tree is still standing, but it doesn't have any leaves or really any limbs left. That's called a snag. Fallen logs and snags are really important for forests, actually, because they provide food for a lot of animals, for insects, and then other animals come along and eat those insects. They provide habitat. Sometimes they're hollow and animals live inside them and things like that. So they're actually quite important. Over here, you should know this figure and caption. The forest provides ecosystem services. Not every single thing on here is an ecosystem service. This is just, actually on this picture, I think it is. So, it's things that benefit us. Remember, an ecosystem service benefits humans, either environmentally or economically. So it provides oxygen that we breathe, or it provides an health, beauty, and recreation. So we do get medicine and things like that from forests. So you should know several of those so that if you are ever asked something on an FRQ, you can name, 2 or 3. On the next page, talks about carbon storage in forests. Forests do something that we say sequester. They sequester carbon. That means they pull carbon out of the atmosphere and they store it inside their biomass. So the trees pull the carbon out of the atmosphere and they make the wood inside them and the leaves and things like that. So they store the carbon and they take it out of the atmosphere. On the other hand, though, if the plants die or they're cut down or burned, all the carbon that was stored inside them now goes back up into the atmosphere. You should know the economic benefits of forests. More than just timber and wood. We get lots of things from the forest. We get food, we get medicine, we get makeup, we get all kinds of different products from the forest. Then section 12.2 is about forest loss. You should know this term, deforestation. It just means when trees are removed more quickly than they can regrow. And so, the forest basically goes away. Then this is talking about one of the main reasons for deforestation is agriculture. People want that land to grow crops, to feed themselves and their family and make money, and wood products. So it talks about that here. On the next page, you should know this figure and caption because there's a term that you should know. Let me go back up to here. Old growth or primary forest, which right here, means forest that has never been logged. or not in thousands of years. So the trees are very old. It's a very established, stable ecosystem. It has more biodiversity. It's crucial habitat for endangered species, such as the spotted owl. So there are old growth forests in the Northwest that are the only place that the spotted owl lives. And the people there want to, they want to log there. They want to get the timber. And the environmentalists are saying, no, we have to save the spotted owl. This has been about 15, 20 years ago, but it was a huge debate between the environmentalists and the industries that wanted to log the forests to get the timber. You should know what deforestation causes. Deforestation can cause soil degradation through erosion, because all the trees are actually holding, their roots are holding the soil in place. When they're not there, the soil can be washed away. Species extinction can happen because the habitat is lost. You get biodiversity loss. That can be plants, that can be animals, that can be insects, it can be any number of things. And then when there's deforestation, that adds CO2 to the atmosphere, which increases global warming. So you've removed the plants that were taking the carbon out. And then if you burn them, which I said also burning here, if you burn them, now you're putting even more carbon into the atmosphere, which will increase global warming. Deforestation can actually cause the collapse of a civilization. For example, Easter Island. That's the island that has those giant statues that mostly you just see the heads of them, and it's just grass. And they think that people cut down all the trees, and then because it was an island, they didn't really have any way to regrow them, and so they had to leave, and so the civilization there collapsed. Additionally, deforestation causes an increase in the temperature in streams and soil. So those streams and the soil were originally shaded by the trees, and the shade kept the temperature down, but when the trees are removed, the temperature goes up. And it decreases groundwater because the tree roots actually, when it rains, they pull water into the soil, and then they use some of it, and the rest of it trickles down and recharges the aquifers. And so the tree roots actually hold the water in the soil, and so if they're gone, then the groundwater isn't able to be replenished as quickly. All right, moving on to page 314. You should know this figure, both of these figures and captions. It's showing up here where they've done some slash and burn in a forest to clear it for agriculture. And then this part is showing you the annual change in forest area by region. And it's only from 1990 to 2015, but all the areas that are green have actually increased their forest cover, and the areas that are pink and red have decreased their forest cover, so they've lost forest. And so the US has increased forest cover. Part of the problem with that, though, is that it's not old growth, it is new forest, but it's still better than nothing. Then on the next page, the tree cover loss in tropical forests has been increasing. What that means is that they are cutting it down faster and faster. The rate of tree loss is going up. Developing countries are poor, and they want economic benefits from the forest. So they see that as, you know, their sovereign territory that they should be able to reap the economic benefits from, the way that more developed countries have. And there's definitely an argument to be made there. All right, on page 316, I wrote this little note here that it's almost a tragedy of the commons in this way, except that the forests are in individual countries, and they are the properties of those countries. Developed countries have cut down a lot of their forests, and they've gotten rich off of these sorts of things, agriculture and mining and resources. And now we are telling the less developed countries, don't do that. And these people are like, well, we're poor, what are we going to do? And so it starts to talk a little bit about some of the things that we can do for these less developed countries. There are things which sometimes people will pay for a concession, and so they pay the country for the right to extract that resource. So that's not the best option, because we'd prefer that the resource stay where it was, especially in terms of forests. But over here, there are things that are, they're talking about conservation concessions. This is money to a nation. So somebody, the governments or something, is paying the nation to keep their national resources intact. And so they'll say, we'll give you this much money to not cut down the rainforest. And, and that way they're not cutting it down to make farms. They're able to give people money, like maybe they benefit the economy and create jobs or any number of things, or maybe it might just be a direct payout. Then there's also the debt for nature swap. And so sometimes countries have debt that they want to pay off. And so people will they'll raise money to pay off their debt so that they don't have to harvest their natural resources to pay off debt. You should know this figure and caption. This is talking about palm oil plantations, which is also mentioned up here. If you look here, here's like an old growth forest. Here's land that has been cleared for a palm oil plantation. Looks vastly different. And in Borneo, for example, there's only this much forested land left that hasn't been converted to palm oil plantations. These forests are the only place that orangutans live. And so the more land that gets cleared for palm plantations, the less there is for orangutans. And they're actually pretty critically endangered. So if you can avoid products with palm oil, that would be good. Over here, it talks about the REDD+ system, which is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And this is something that wealthy industrialized nations have developed to where they will pay developing countries to conserve their forests. So very similar to what we were talking about over here, but it's a organized effort internationally coming out of different climate conferences, but it is not working for a variety of reasons. Some people are not, the money is just not making it to the developing countries that need it, so they are still cutting down their forests because they're not getting the resources that they need. Then we move on to section 12.3, which is about forest management. You should know the term resource management. That just means that, there are jobs out there for people who do resource management. That could be fisheries, that could be wildlife, that could be forests, but they want to make sure that all of these resources are being used sustainably. On the next page, you should know this curve, and you should know this idea here then that resource managers do. They use a topic or a principle called maximum sustainable yield. And the idea is that you want to extract as much as possible of the resource to gain as much economic benefit as you can while still allowing it to replenish for the next year. So I think you guys saw some of that in our Tragedy of the Commons fishing activity. If you could, you could get enough money to feed your family and survive and maybe make a little bit of extra money and still leave enough fish to repopulate the ocean. So it's kind of the same idea here. You might do that for a fishery or a forest or something. You might allow some logging but leave some behind so that it can continue to grow. So that idea of maximum sustainable yield. You should know about the U.S. National Forest Service. And so that's the organization in the U.S. government that takes care of our national forests. So we'll talk about national forests in a second. It manages the use of the land in terms of logging and recreation. So national forests are not off limits to logging. They can be logged, but in the U.S. now, you have to replace, if you do any sort of logging or timber, you must replace it with seedlings so that there's no net loss in forest cover. Gifford Pinchot is the father of the U.S. Forest Service, and he started it, I think, right here in 1905. And so he was a German guy who did forestry in Europe and came over and started the science of forestry in the U.S. We do extract timber from private and public lands. And this graph up here is kind of interesting because it shows all the publicly owned land in the U.S. and the different colors represent different kinds of things. The purple is owned by the Bureau of Land Management. The blue is Fish and Wildlife. The green is Forest Service. And then the brown is National Parks. And you can see that the bulk of publicly owned lands are in the West. And the reason for that is that we didn't really decide that we needed to protect lands until the early 1900s. And at that point, all of this land in the east was pretty much privately owned. And so there was very little of it that could be protected at that point. But all the stuff to the west, there was still a lot of land. And so a lot of it was set aside and protected as public land. All right, let me turn to 320. This is talking about plantation forests. So a plantation forest kind of goes back to this idea about timber and cutting stuff down. They have basically what's called it's a tree farm. And so if you look at this picture, you can see kind of this forest that's all different sorts of species, and they're different ages, different types of trees, and there's a lot of biodiversity there. And then it gets cut down, and then they plant stuff back, but generally they plant only one kind of tree back. Usually pine, because it's fast growing, and so they can come back in 15 or 20 years and harvest all that pine and plant it again. And so some of the problems with this is that it is monoculture. There's only one thing growing there. It's what we call even aged, so it's all the same size. So there's no difference in the canopy and the understory. It's all kind of growing at the same rate. And there's less biodiversity and less niches for animals to live in, and resource partitioning and all of that kind of stuff that a fully functioning ecosystem would have going on. Then we're talking about harvesting timber here. You should know clear cutting. This is a picture of what clear cutting looks like after the fact. They come through and they just cut everything down. Some of the problems is the soil erodes. There's more sun, like I was talking about, so it gets hotter. And that will change the species that live there. So things that used to want a lower temperature or more shade are not able to live there anymore. It is the cheapest way to harvest timber. It's the easiest. They can come in and they can just cut it all down. And it is also the safest for people because they don't have to work around all the other trees and things like that. They just cut down everything in their way. On this page, it talks about some of the other types of timber harvesting things, and they're also described over here on this page. So this is clear cutting. So here's the original forest, clear cutting. Everything is cut down, and then you have an even aged forest of generally monoculture coming back. In seed tree or shelter wood, they're kind of similar. They leave one tree maybe to produce seeds so that the babies can grow from that. So you can see that all these little babies look just like that one. Or maybe it's called a shelter wood because it provides shade and things like that for these trees to grow in. And then this third one is actually called a selection system. So you have the original forest and they just cut a few trees in between. And then those few trees will kind of grow back. And that's generally considered to be the best because it leaves a lot of the biodiversity in the forest. You should know about the National Forest Management Act that was in 1976, and it mandated that every national forest draw up plans for renewable resource management. So you should know the provisions for that act that are mainly here in this bulleted list. Okay. All right, on 322, this picture shows actually a pine forest in the southeastern United States. So if you go into the forest around here, it looks a lot like that. And they're talking about ecosystem-based management in that particular picture. Then we move on to the idea of fire and forests. And it says fire can hurt or help forests. Fires have been going through forests forever. As long as there have been trees, there have been fires burning them down. Low intensity frequent fires are actually good for forests. They clear out debris on the forest floor, like leaf litter or small plants or things like that that might be competition. So they thin the forest out. They'll take some of the smaller trees out and the big trees will have more room to grow. And they can also germinate seeds. So there are certain trees where their seeds won't germinate until a fire has gone through. The sequoia, if you've ever seen the giant sequoia in California, and a lot of pine trees are this way. So the pine cones and the pine seeds will fall down onto the forest floor and they'll just sit there until a fire goes through, and the heat of the fire will actually then cause the seed to germinate. So years of fire suppression has actually led to catastrophic mega fires because this isn't happening. They're not clearing out the debris. They're not thinning the forest. And so the fuel for the fires is just building and building and building. And so the fires, when they finally do erupt, are huge. They're called mega fires. So we can do some things to prevent mega fires. We can have what's called a prescribed fire or a controlled burn. And this is when a forest manager would come through on a nice non-windy day, and they would dig some ditches along the edges, and they would set a fire that will go through the forest. And I've actually seen one. Here's a picture kind of one. It's incredible. They know exactly what the forest is going to, or what the fire is going to do. It will follow a certain path. It will burn all the stuff at the forest floor, and the tree, because they're small and low intensity, doesn't hurt the big mature trees. They're able to survive it just fine. And so it clears out the base of the forest, and then all that ash puts minerals back in the soil. There's also something called salvage logging, which is going back to that picture where it had the snags and the fallen logs. And that's letting people come in and harvest those. But as I said, that's kind of a problem because a lot of animals use those snags and fallen logs as habitat and food. So that's why I wrote plus and minus here. You should know the Healthy Forest Restoration Act right here in 2003. Congress passed that, so you should know the provisions of that. Then over on this part, it's talking about climate change and how climate change is promoting pest outbreaks. The number one reason for that is that the winters, normally when winter gets very cold, a lot of the pests, bugs, and insects, they die off. And if we're not having those cold winters, we're having milder winters, they don't have the die off, and so the pest numbers get very huge, and it's killing off a lot of forests. This picture right here is showing a bark beetle, and if you look, it's eating the bark of this particular pine. And if you've ever driven up into the mountains and you've seen pines that look like this, that's what they're dying from. They're dying from these beetles eating their bark. It's not like, pine trees don't lose their leaves or turn colors in the fall, so that's not normal. So the idea of sustainable forestry is gaining ground, like everything, right? And there's something called a sustainable forest certification. And sometimes if you look on notebooks or things like that, you will see a little symbol that says FSC in a triangle. And that means that it's been certified that paper came from sustainably harvested wood products. So you should know some of the examples, and you should know these principles of forest stewardship. And then we're kind of moving on to national parks. So I think this is 12.4, I think. So parks and protected areas. National parks, why do we have them? We've set aside land for the public to enjoy. It is purely for recreation. It is not for resource extraction. So you cannot take anything out of a national park. You can't do any mining. You can't do any logging. You can't do anything like that. It is just to go and be in nature. The very first one was Yellowstone, which was way back in 1872. National parks must be declared by Congress. So it takes an act of Congress to make a new national park. And then underneath here is the Great Smoky Mountains, which I'm sure many of you have been to since it's right up in the mountains near us. You should know the Antiquities Act of 1906, and the reason that's important is because I just said that a national park needed to be declared by Congress, but the Antiquities Act enabled presidents to be able to set aside land for protection without requiring Congress to do it. And so they can set aside something called a national monument, and it'll be a smaller area, maybe not quite as important as a national park, but it still gets set aside and protected then. You should know what national wildlife refuges are, which are basically just areas where wildlife are allowed to grow. They can't be hunted or anything like that in those areas. We talked about marine protected areas before. It's just these are on land. And then a wilderness area is something a little bit different. And this is a picture of a wilderness area. Wilderness areas are protected. They're they're nationally managed, but they are like, if you've ever heard of no trace camping or something like that. There's no roads inside them. usually no vehicles allowed, so you can hike and you can camp, but anything that you take in, you have to bring out with you. So it's all kind of no impact camping and hiking that goes on in a wilderness area so that they stay pristine. Not everybody supports national parks and national land management. And you should know the debates in this section here. There have been a lot recently. There was in 2017, the Trump administration tried to reduce the size of Bears Ears National Monument, which was within his rights according to the Antiquities Act. But there was a huge outcry, and I think they ended up not doing it. And then there was in 2016, some armed militants took over a wildlife refuge in Oregon because they didn't agree with the way the federal government was managing it. So you definitely need to know some of those because they're important debates on national land management. Then we get to this idea of a land trust over here. And a land trust is when land is purchased not by the government, but by some sort of organization, generally, like what you would consider charity or a foundation or something like that. The Nature Conservancy is the world's largest land trust, and they select areas for protection all the time, and they raise money and they buy them and they keep them. It's like a park land or something like that, but it's not managed by the federal government. There are biosphere reserves. All of these three are on the next page. Biosphere reserves, World Heritage Sites, and this idea of UNESCO. So let me turn the page here. Biosphere reserves are kind of what they sound like. It's just areas with exceptional biodiversity, and they are preserved and overseen by the United Nations. A World Heritage Site is similar to a biosphere reserve, only it can be cultural. So something like the pyramids in Egypt might be a World Heritage Site, or Machu Picchu or something like that. So it can be cultural as well. And again, this is overseen by the United Nations. And so UNESCO is the branch of the United Nations that oversees this sort of land management stuff. Here it's asking about how much protected area is needed. You should read that because it talks about how much we have protected and how much some environmentalists estimate that we need. So why are preserves important? Well, we need to have them in terms of things like habitat fragmentation. So this picture here shows habitat fragmentation. There was forest, but then, some of it it looks like it's been cut down and mowed for hay. And then this is just some sort of grass. It's probably like a range or something like that for animals to graze on. There's a road going through the middle of it and so on. So there's all sorts of fragmentation going on here. And this is showing, this is how much forest there was. Then in just 50 years later, and then almost none another 70 years after that. And this is all in British Columbia. So this fragmentation causes some problems, one of which is called edge effects. And what that means is that if you generally live in the middle of the forest, then the living conditions here at the edge are not the same as what they are in the middle. So it makes the livable area for certain things even smaller. And then it moves on to island biogeography theory, which we have already covered, but we'll summarize it really quickly. And there's a science behind the story here that you can read. It's pretty interesting. This is the island biogeography theory stuff underneath here. Basically, you know it. The closer an island is, the more migration there can be. The bigger an island is, the more migration there can be, and so on. And we talked about how on land, you can have the same thing happening, and that national parks are like habitat islands. And so you have these large national parks, but then the animals, they can't move from one to the other, so they're kind of stuck there, or they move off of it and they can be hunted or killed, maybe even just from getting hit by a car or something like that. And so there is a debate on designing national parks and things like that called the single large or several small debate, meaning should we make one giant national park or should we make lots of little small national parks? And it kind of depends on what your goal is, because some animals, like say elephants or things like that, they benefit from a single large habitat because they move around a lot and they have a huge range requirement. Versus, smaller animals might be able to live in the smaller protected areas. Then we came up with the idea, so it's called SLOS, single large or several small. But then there's this idea of, well, maybe we can connect these reserves together through wildlife corridors. And I know that we've talked about those before. And I think, yep, that's it for chapter 12.